Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this special edition of our morning briefing series on the morning after the US elections. My name is Stöckmann and I'm head of the Director's Office here at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, as you know, we are talking about the US elections. As of 8 a.m. this morning, by all accounts available, Donald Trump has won the election. He has flipped Georgia and taken North Carolina. Pennsylvania, I believe, has just been called. He's also ahead in Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona, although there's some room left in some of the other swing states. Fox News has called the election, and the German media, as I'm sure you've heard this morning, have started to debate what a second Trump term might entail. Meanwhile, the Senate looks like the Republicans have at least 51 seats, flipping Ohio and West Virginia. Things are still left unclear in the House. I'm sure we'll come back to that as well. An American friend of mine texted me this morning saying that people were feeling like they don't know their own country. And that was true in quite a literal sense, given the different media universes and the urban-rural divide. Just to add this personal note. But to discuss these questions in more depth, I'm honored to introduce a distinguished panel this morning. Daniel Benjamin is president of the American Academy in Berlin. Before coming to Berlin, he was the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. And before that, ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism at the US Department of State from 2009 to 2012. Welcome, Daniel Benjamin, online. I hope you can hear us and see us.
All good here, thank you.
Next up will be my colleague Rachel Tausendfreund, who joined the German Council on Foreign Relations in September 2024 as Senior Research Fellow on US and Transatlantic Relations. Previously, Rachel was a Senior Fellow for Geostrategy at the GMF, German Marshall Fund, and also from 2015 to 2022, Editorial Director at GMF. Glad to have you, Rachel, and thank you for doing this after, I think, a host of other media.
A few other things, yes, but I'm happy to be here, I guess. I'm happy to be here, despite the rather unhappy circumstance. Yeah.
Last but not least, our director, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who is joining us from Cambridge in the US. Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff was previously Guido Goldman Distinguished Scholar for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund and headed the Berlin team of the GMF. He was previously a journalist with the German weekly Die Zeit, inter alia heading the DC bureau for a while, and from 2013 to 2017, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff was advisor and speechwriter for Federal German President Joachim Gauck. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then after a bit of forth and back on the panel, open up for Q&A after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand either here in the room or online. My colleagues will be helping to field questions from the chat. And finally, before we begin, just a word of thanks to all of the colleagues of DGAP supporting this morning briefing series, Milan Nitsch, Henning Hoff, Julia Löwer, Patrick Teichmann, Helga Beck, and many others. So this is very much a joint effort. Thanks to all of them. But now, a round of applause. Yes, please. Now, without much further ado, I'd like to start with you, Daniel. What do you make of the results as they now stand, and how does this differ from what you expected?
Well, good morning, and let's see if I can come up with 5 minutes of coherent thoughts after quite a night. Although the polls had told us for a long time that this was a very possible outcome, it nonetheless comes as a shock, and I will go to my grave remembering all the different signals that I thought were suggesting a very different outcome from most, at the very end of the game, the Iowa poll to, I don't know how many things, Kamala's enormous rise in the polls right after Biden's departure. And it will be forever a reproof towards, I guess, intuitive thinking. So, we're in uncharted territory. I believe the Democrats will hold on to the House. The Republicans will have, it looks like, a very strong showing in the Senate, perhaps 56 seats. And Trump himself, is wholly unpredictable. And I was struck by a remark that he was quoted as making in a recent story in the Atlantic, in which he talked about how much he hated being disciplined and being on message with his own speeches, and how much he preferred to improvise. And I think that we're once again going to be forced to deal with a lot of improvisation, and a lot of it, certainly from a European perspective, that is not very welcome. And there may be a lot of Americans who feel the same way. I'm quite sure that there will be a lingering shock in the United States for at least 50% of the population. It will be interesting to see if he winds up winning the popular vote. And if he isn't, then this will be the 6th time out of 7 or something like that the Republicans have lost the popular vote, and the 3rd time in a very short period of time, historically speaking, less than a quarter century, in which Republicans have had a minority government again. I think that is going to contribute to a continuing disillusion with the American institutions of government, that we could have such an anti-democratic result if that is in fact what happens. I think that there will be a lot of wondering whether the United States simply is incapable of electing a woman, whether racism played a big role in the outcome. And there is going to be, I think it will have a shattering effect. The whole experience will have a shattering effect on the Democratic Party, I think in a profound way, and it is going to have to try to find its bearings again. Again, no predicting what Trump will do, and no predicting how much after a victory like this he will respect, the remaining norms of government that he hadn't violated before. And I'll just wind up, here by saying we don't know what will happen, for example, with the integrity of the different branches of government. That is to say, how he will try to work around a Democratic House. There are all kinds of things to be fearful about regarding the U.S. civil servants, which has been nonpartisan, of course, for more than a century. And we don't know what's going to happen regarding the filibuster in the Senate. I assume it's gone. I think we're in for some fairly rough sledding, and I think that Europeans will be really challenged to adjust to the new set of realities.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You said that we are entering uncharted territory, and yet it's perhaps not quite as uncharted as the last time around. So I'd like to come back to that during the follow-up on the panel just a bit. But before we come back to you, Rachel, over to you. Pollsters were frank about the uncertainty of this election for a long time. But still, what made this election so unpredictable, and what are the next steps now? Over to you for your initial remarks.
I mean, polls are never good at the small differences, right? So the polls were just telling us that it was close. The polls told us that Kamala picked up the gap that Biden had developed. Trump had quite a lead after the debate in summer, and Kamala managed to close most of the gap. But the polls were actually telling us the entire time that she was just barely closing it. So I think there was a lot of optimistic reading of the polls as opposed to the polls themselves. And also pollsters will always tell you, I mean, there's a, 3% margin of error difference. So that ends up to be a 6% margin that you can have, right? If someone's +3 and the other person's -3. And we don't know yet if that's the case. I mean, that Trump won big. I mean, it looks like he might win the popular vote, and that's significant. I mean, if he really does win the popular vote, because as Daniel said, it's been quite a long time since the Republicans won the popular vote. Looks like he has more turnout in than he did in 2020. That that there were Trump voters who hadn't turned up in 2016 and hadn't turned up in 2020 and turned up now, which can be rather surprising to many of us. On the other hand, it's one of those things that you hear so often that it's annoying and you feel like it can't be true, but it does appear to be the economy stupid. And you can say what you will and be as troubled as one might be by Trump's remarks, but if 63% of people in Michigan and 67% of people in Pennsylvania feel like the country is on the wrong track economically, and eggs are 160% more expensive than they were before Biden took office, and gas is 50%. And in Michigan and Pennsylvania, you use a lot of gas. There's big distances to cover to get anywhere. These are things that matter to people, and apparently, some people underestimated the importance that economics still has on these things. We don't know yet. For example, Michigan is still open because Wayne County, which is where Detroit is and Dearborn is, and that's where the majority of the population is. And Biden won that by a little over 300,000 just in that county alone. And so there's still space there for Harris to close the gap and win Michigan, but it doesn't matter. But what'll be interesting to see is it looks so far like Democrats in university towns and Democrats in Philadelphia and perhaps in Wayne County didn't turn out. That might be partly Gaza, especially in Wayne County where Dearborn is. But it might also just be that people were less excited about Harris and more unhappy with the state of the country than Democrats wanted them to be.
Thank you, Rachel. Still, there are so many surprises and confusing things about this election. The Latino vote, for instance. I mean, how can you make these remarks and not have an effect on the Latino vote and the Black vote also, and in new places, as far as I gather. So, how do you explain that?
I mean, in a way, it's almost a positive development. It's demographically a problem for the Democrats, but in terms of American democracy, it's a positive development if we start to realize Latinos are people with as diverse opinions as white people. So we understand that there are liberal white people and there are conservative white people. Well, shock, the same is true for also Latinos and also the Black American community. So first of all, we don't know yet the role that sexism might have played in this, but it looked like Latino men and Black men were less excited to vote for Kamala Harris than they had been to vote for Obama. That could be also the economy, though. And one forgets in the kind of cultural capitals of the world where where your minority colleagues are also from the cultural elite and probably from big cities, and from that there are lots of Latinos and Black Americans who live in rural America, and most of them are similarly conservative. And so this is seems to be a new revelation, but it's in a way, I think it's a sophistication of our thinking that's actually going to be good, although that means that the Democrats are going to have to figure out a different kind of coalition in order to win in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where you have enough of a rural population that the big cities can't make up the difference.
Mhm. I think you're absolutely right, and the latest Gallup polls also show that the economy was by far the top policy issue. But we are a foreign policy think tank, and so we also want to look at the foreign policy implications of all of this. I'm now looking over to the screen to Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. What are the first reactions on the other side of the big pond? What do you think this means for transatlantic relations, as far as you can tell from now?
Would you allow me to because it's such an earth-shattering moment to stick with what we're seeing for 1 second before we get to consequences, and allow me to make 3 remarks on what we're seeing. I would say first, this is a change election. I think we live in unstable times. People are usually dissatisfied with governments, any government. I think we know something about that in Germany. It's people are angry. It's very hard to get reelected during unstable times like this. And I think this played into Trump's hands in 2016 over Clinton. It played into Biden's hands in 2020 over Trump. And it played into Trump's hands again over Harris tonight. Harris has presented herself as a change candidate, as a different generation, again directed against the politics of hate and anger and a new beginning. But it didn't sell. 70% of the people thought the country was on the wrong track. 80% in Pennsylvania wanted change. 40% job approval only for Biden. And a few minutes ago, just before this event started, Donald Trump gave his victory speech, and on the side of the big hall that where he was a big campaign sign. It said, "Trump will fix it." So Kamala broke it. Trump will fix it. And why does that sell? Leads you to the second point, which Rachel already alluded to. It's the economy, stupid. When I came over here, at some point I had to go shopping, and you have to buy groceries. And I have to tell you, I was shocked, and literally shocked at the prices. I took pictures of the stuff that I bought to send it over to my family. Can you believe this? And so it became, once you get here, it becomes much clearer to you that for an average income earner, the price of everything is unbearable, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help when Democrats tell people that actually the economy is growing, everything is fine, inflation is under control, prices of gas have gone down by 30%. If that happens on a level where the months lasts much longer than the paycheck will allow them to. So I think people they don't, that doesn't necessarily mean that they vote for or that they like Trump. They just don't like what this government has put in front of them, and they make them responsible for it. So I think the economy is such a headwind for Harris that it was very hard to overcome. Next point, I think, is what we have seen is that the patriarchy is striking back. Yes, there's a gender gap. And yes, that was to the advantage of Democrats. And yes, given the Supreme Court decisions, it made a lot of sense to build a campaign or elements of a campaign around the choice question. But how far do you go with that? Can you base a campaign simply on trust the women? And the result of that was that the gender gap became 21% in the last polling, 11% more women for Harris, about 10% more men for Trump. That essentially cancels itself out. And what we have seen is that the Harris campaign didn't seem to reach out enough to men, while Trump succeeded in what they called his bro strategy. I found it striking in the last campaign event in Michigan when Trump appeared and was introduced by Megyn Kelly, former Fox News journalist, and she said in introducing him to other women, she said, "I understand you like a little girl power, but think about it. You can't win if your husband, your father, and your brother lose." So it was a direct play towards the strategy. And when you look at the dramatic shifts in Latino population, these are mostly men. When you look at the shifts, not quite as dramatic with black voters, it's mostly men. And that seems to me to speak against both of the interpretations that this is about strict sexism or that it is about racism, because it is black men that abandoned Harris. Rather, the discussion needs to start whether this is the beginning of the end of identity politics when used as a campaign issue. So I think I'll stop here, and I apologize for not answering your question, Jan, but I'm sure we'll be getting to the consequences in the course of this conversation.
Thank you, Thomas, and don't worry, I will ask my question again. But I wanted to also give Rachel a chance to react because I saw that she grabbed the mic.
I mean, I basically just wanted to underscore a couple of the points. I mean, I could also answer the beginning of the foreign policy question if you wanted. I mean, I think for Germany, a cold winter is coming. That would be the first mark. In terms of, I see Tom here is in the front, gas prices might sink. That could be a good sign because it's going to be a very pro drilling and gas exporting economy. So if that's maybe one plus for Germany, but otherwise, we have an emboldened Trump. If you have, you're going to have looks certain to be a Republican majority in the Senate. This is important for confirmations. You would need then Republicans to stand against problematic nominees of the president. Republicans in the last years have not demonstrated a lot of willingness to stand up for things against the president. So that's something to be slightly concerned about because a lot of the most important positions need Senate confirmation, which should be a check on the most extreme candidates. But if you have a Republican-controlled Senate and the Republicans feel like supporting the president, then we'll get Trumpist cabinet officials and in the State Department and in Defense Department. So that's one thing I would point to in terms of foreign policy implications to start, and then we can go from there.
Thank you. So before I open up for a Q&A, I just wanted to give Daniel a chance to react and also pose my earlier question again, since you mentioned the uncharted territory that we're entering. Indeed, commentators have said this election is about the state of democracy in the US. It has the potential to change the international order. On the other hand, we've seen more of a preparation from various think tanks, etc., for what might come after a Trump win in this time around. So I wonder if you could say a few words about the extent to which we're entering an unknown era, but also please feel free to react to what Thomas and Rachel have said so far. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, so a few quick points. Following on what Rachel said, I think we are in uncharted territory precisely because the so-called grown-ups won't be in the room anymore. There will be no Jim Mattis, no Rex Tillerson, no John Kelly to keep Donald Trump from doing what he wants, and he will have enablers. And so I think that it is truly an unpredictable moment. I just wanted to elaborate a little more, perhaps on the point that it's the economy, stupid, and why some of these minority groups are voting the way they do. First of all, I think we see a tendency in American democracy as time goes by for different ethnic groups to begin voting their class instead of their ethnicity. And that's a large reason why we see diminution in the Hispanic vote and also even in the African-American vote. So that's one thing. But I also want to go beyond it was the inflation and the cost of eggs. Donald Trump's message is there's a corrupt system and I'm gonna fix it. The corrupt system has to do. I don't think it's a serious or genuine promise on his part, but it is about I think it's about inequality to a large extent in the United States, and not just an unusual, indeed unprecedented for most people, period of inflation, but rather the sense that the system is delivering profoundly different outcomes for different people in the country. And we talk about how much more unequal the United States is than Germany, for example. And I think this is where the chickens are coming home to roost. Germany, of course, benefited greatly from globalization in the United States, coastal elites and a thin crust of the uppermost earners benefited. But I think it's also now the feeling among many voters that they're getting screwed and they don't like it. They put their hope in Trump. I think they put their hope in a false prophet on this one, but nonetheless, that has been the message, and that's where it's going. And let's not forget the American economy is the envy of the world, and there's been plenty of polling indicating that the partisanship or the partisan lens had a big influence on how people saw the economy, which is to say, people would tell pollsters, I'm doing fine, I'm doing okay, but the rest of the economy is just garbage. It's horrible out there, despite the fact that the U.S. is growing, its entrepreneurship is thriving, so on and so forth. So I think it's a much more systemic thing than about the price of groceries, upsetting as they might be. So I think I've answered the questions, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Now, if you would like to ask a question, could you please briefly introduce yourself and keep your comments or questions relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. We do have a microphone in the room, which is important so people online can hear us. And why don't we start over here in the first row, and then move backwards.
Front. I'm Tom O'Donnell. I've been here for, 13 years. I'm an American, but I work on energy and geopolitics. And I'm not going to ask about energy. I grew up with the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s, the Cultural Revolution in the United States, which created a class of people that were ready to be used in the third industrial revolution in my country, which was the center of information technology and all these changes, which was the basis for globalization. Great success. The Democratic Party was the party that represented the interests of this class transformation. I heard the word inequality from Daniel. But I want to go under that and say there's been just like in the second industrial revolution, farmers went from 80 or 90% to about 7% or less, 3% now. Industrial workers in my country in the 50s were 50%, highest percentage in the world, down to single digits. There's a huge class transformation. And the problem I would like people to speak about is what is the new politics that the Democrat type people can go into, because they took advantage of this, I think, in an opportunistic way, shaming the people who are left out. That's what, and not providing for them.
Thank you. Rachel, you look like you want to take this question up.
Yeah, I can take the one. I mean, everybody points to Trump's kind of overt racism and anti-migrant campaigning in 2016, I mean. But I think maybe more important is that Trump represented a different economic package than Republican voters were used to getting from Republicans. So Republican voters are conservative people, but they were getting neoliberal economics, right? Mitt Romney, et cetera. I mean, George Bush was perfect because he could combine the two. He sort of had the packaging of a normal guy who like saws trees on his land in Texas, but also represents big business. And then Trump was kind of the first figure who was an economic populist on the Republican side. And I think that that's actually a lot of the Trump voters. I think they're more motivated by that than they are by, I mean, this is also me wanting to be hopeful and also me knowing a lot of these people. And I think they're not primarily motivated by, you know, xenophobic and racist. They are motivated by this idea that the elite have, you know, watched our economy crumble and inequality grow, and they haven't done anything about it. And the picking of J.D. Vance very much has this economic populist, you know, industrial heartland. Now, interestingly, he's also venture capitalist. And so it's hard to tell what's real there, but absolutely the messaging is completely radical from a Republican perspective. And I think that they've realized that that's something they need to do to win the voters. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch and see what happens with the Republican Party, because they're very much divided on this. All of the money of the Republican Party is still libertarian, but their voters are economic populists. And the Democrats, under Clinton, they lost the economic populists. They lost the industrial workers. I mean, I come from Michigan, right? And NAFTA was supposed to make us all rich, but instead it moved a lot of jobs away. Now it was also China, it was also robots. But, you know, but people think that it was NAFTA and trade. And so I agree with you. I think that is a huge shift going on right now in American politics. I don't remember his name, but there's someone who just wrote a book about like the emerging political order and saying, you know, what we had was we had first the New Deal order, which was a kind of industrial policy, social welfare system order that was so powerful that even the Republicans had to adapt, right? So even Eisenhower supported a social welfare system because it became just the standard. And then you had the emergence of a neoliberal order that was so powerful that even the Democrats had to adapt a neoliberal type of thinking. And now that has crumbled. That has definitely crumbled, and we're not exactly though sure are we gonna get New Deal 2? You know, is it gonna be that Bidenomics is the thing, even though it didn't happen fast enough for Biden to win, or I don't know. But I think that's very much a big part of the story.
Thank you. I see more questions. One here in the middle, and perhaps we could collect a few because they're quite a few.
Klaus Wittmann, Potsdam University. I would like to ask Thomas a question about what this means for us. Mrs. Strack-Zimmermann last year said we have already missed 3 Trump-free years. And when Klingbeil was in an interview this morning, he said we can no longer fully rely on the United States. And the moderator said, this is a déjà vu, because Mrs. Merkel said the same thing in a beer tent 7 years ago. So my question is, what have we missed in the last 3 or the last 7 years, and what do we have to do, and perhaps expeditiously? In Europe and in Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Wittmann. So missed opportunities in terms of preparation. Let me take up one more question on this side of the room.
Building on the very question we just heard, I would be interested in Daniel Benjamin's perspective on what's going to be the first steps of the new Trump government towards Germany. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so let's keep those 2 questions for this round. We'll come back to you in the next question about missed opportunities for preparation for Thomas, and then moving on to Daniel.
Well, it has taken us Germans years to understand the shift in global order, in the secular shift in American foreign policy. Both are connected. We have it is an understandable, and I think it's an understandable development on Germany's part. Post 1990, surrounded and encircled by friends, as Volker Rühe famously said, we were the biggest adherents to the idea of an end of history. And it was the first time since industrialization that the German question, including to the Germans themselves and their neighbors, seemed to be solved. So the idea that we would stick to the system and be the ultimate status quo power is understandable. You don't want to change something that has served you so well. Now, therefore, we have missed the boat as Germans many a time on 2%, on the dangers of Russia. And those are the problems that we're dealing with. Now we're dealing with economic populism from and a doubtful perspective on NATO defense from an American president who has a history of a very solid critique of Germany. So those are the things that we have missed. They're mostly in our mind. We have conducted a Zeitenwende that, beyond the speech, leaves much to be desired. We always pat ourselves on the shoulders that we have changed so much, but the problem is that reality usually changes quicker than we do in Germany, and therefore the gap doesn't close but widen. And certainly last night is such a moment.
Thanks, Thomas. Daniel, did you want to respond to the question about what's to be expected from a Trump administration now?
Well, having just said that he's totally unpredictable, I'm a little chagrined to not have an answer. But I wouldn't be surprised if the first demand was that Germany fall in line behind the United States in supporting an effort to bring the Ukraine war to a close. And I would like to maybe just add gratuitously, if I might, that the first thing Germans should do in anticipation of Donald Trump's inauguration is ensure that in whatever it is, 2027, defense spending doesn't dip below 2% as it's currently scheduled to do, because that is just painting a big fat target on Germany for a Trump attack.
Thank you. So there are many aspects that we could talk about in terms of the next Trump administration personnel. I've heard the names of Mike Pompeo and Richard Grenell in the media, which might sound familiar to some. But there are so many things to talk about, and this is your event, so I'd like to hand the next question over to you, sir.
Yeah.
Much does that work?
Thank you very much. My name is Bernd Fischer, retired ambassador. I would like to put into the debate the word migration, because I was wondering if he only spoke about inflation, one of the two catchwords, because migration plays a certain role in the German debate at the moment, not inflation. So that was my question.
Thank you so much. That's an important keyword. And allow me to throw in another important word, which hasn't been mentioned here, but which is being brought up in the chat: Ukraine. What does this mean for Ukraine? So on the side of analyzing the results, migration, and then in terms of implications, what does this mean for Ukraine? Can I hand over to you first, Rachel?
Sure. I mean, you know, we'll see what the details of the results tell us when we get, you know, the exact numbers from everywhere. But, you know, there can be no doubt that migration was for Trump last time and was again for Trump this time a really strong topic. That partly out of a reality which was under the Biden, actually it started at the very end of the Trump administration, to be fair, though that was never part of any of the graphs that Trump showed, but we did have a massive increase in irregular border entries at the southern border that was unprecedented. Got over the 2.6 million mark, and that was just significantly higher. And I think there was a 63% increase in asylum applications, things like this. And so, this was a strong topic for Trump, and migration works in two ways. One, it's the sort of the government is failing, right? Which goes along with the inequality and all of the other points you're making, right? Like the government is failing to do its job. And the other reason migration works so well for this is it also targets, the government is failing to do its job for you, the people who are already here. They're helping and being kind and being humane to all these strangers who are out there, and they're not helping you. And so that's both got some, racial tint to it or xenophobic tint to it, but also, again, to this, I'm the one who cares about you. It's got a populist element as well. And so this is a topic that can be very motivating to some people. Whether it brought sort of new voters to Trump, whether that was a factor in what looks like it was a sort of depressed Democratic turnout, there I'm less sure. I think the depressed Democratic turnout was war, conflict, the war in Gaza in particular, and just the very poor economic numbers, more so than migration. That would be my guess. We'll know exactly more when it's, but it's an easy topic to make some powerful points on, and that'll be the case also in the German election.
Thanks, Rachel. Let's move on to implications, as I said, for foreign and defense policy. As far as I understand, the current funds of $60 billion will run for a few more months in terms of Ukraine support. Then things will depend on Congress. But almost immediately, if I understand correctly, Trump could decree to not use U.S. intelligence anymore, which would make a huge difference. And so there are many ways in which this election will probably have an effect on the situation in Ukraine. And I wanted to hand this question over to both of you online. Daniel, if you want to go first, and then Thomas.
I'll let Thomas go first. He'll have a wiser thing to say, and then I can agree with it.
Oh, thank you, Dan. What can I say? I think let's start with the Ukraine question. I think it's a great day in Moscow. Vladimir Putin will have a field day with this election because it will show for him that his strategy of sitting this out until the election will have borne out. I can imagine Mr. Trump looking just as Mr. Putin for some version of a summit to solve questions. In my mind, I see Helsinki. The word Helsinki pops up in my imagination. The major issue here is that if this were to happen, neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans would sit at the table. And from a German perspective, and from a European perspective, and from a Ukrainian perspective, that should be prevented. So our first order of business should be to make sure to sit at the table. Therefore, I think ideas of a European contact group, born for different reasons, but it could be very useful for this purpose. Second point is the question before European governments now, whether they will want and see themselves able to replace the American support for Ukraine. That is a political question as much as it is a financial question. But it is certain that the 50 billion loan that is being created from the windfall profit piece of the proceeds of the frozen Russian assets is not going to be enough to do that.
I would agree with Thomas.
Yeah.
I fear that the shock of the Trump election is going to encourage bandwagoning in Europe across the Atlantic and will make Ukraine seem like one issue of many that need to be bargained over to prevent really hostile action. And if I don't know, I don't know how the discussion will go, but if 20, 30, 40% tariffs are on the table, and profound damage to the international trading system versus Ukraine, who knows where the decision making might go in terms of asking the Ukrainians to swallow hard, take a ceasefire that is not advantageous to them in terms of lost territory and the like. But I think that there are going to be a lot of different balls up in the air at once.
Thanks. Quick reaction from you, Rachel, and then we have.
Yeah, I mean, only to slightly darken the picture even more. Apologies. I mean, I think it will be tempting for a number of European governments to be sort of secretly happy that Trump's the bad guy, because everywhere we're seeing everywhere war fatigue in publics, and we have in Germany perhaps sooner rather than later an election. And so it'll be a big temptation to be like, oh, well, we would have liked to support Ukraine further, but sadly, those Americans, but behind Trump is making it impossible, and so therefore, I guess we have to give up too. That's an easy place for Europeans to land, and I'm afraid that some of them will be tempted. But there's some room, should that not be the case, and that room is between now and January 20th. Europeans don't have the capacity to fill the American gap, but they could buy lots of American things, or as much as possible, for example, if they were to be decisive. So there's room for decisive European action to put Ukraine in a slightly better position, or there's room for the Europeans to sort of happily crumble behind Trump and make the easier decision. And I hope that's not going to be what we see.
Thank you, Rachel. We can pick up this point of the dynamic, the implications on Europe and elections in Germany in a moment, since this is also coming up in the chat. But I want to pick up another question in the room by my colleague, Wiebke.
Hi, Wiebke Evering, Head of Communications here at DGAP. Thomas, you said it's a good day for Moscow, and I wanted to know, we have been talking about disinformation campaigns so much in the run-up to the elections, and yesterday at some point Trump tweeted, oh, so far it has been a fair election, and I think from the Republican camp we won't hear that much of this argument in the coming days. But I would like to hear your opinion. How much disinformation campaign have been impacting these results that we have now?
That's an excellent question. In fact, on Monday, I think several US intelligence services warned again about the dangers of foreign interference, disinformation campaigns, etc. So this is one question, and perhaps we could pair it with the other question about impact on German elections and German politics. But let's take up a third question over here on the far right of the room.
Well, this might just be out of the scope. I wanted to shift the focus from the Atlantic to the Pacific region, because I feel like that hasn't been talked about just now. With the conflict in Ukraine probably not being the focus of US foreign policy, we might see a shift towards the Pacific region. And I wanted to ask specifically, what are the implications of this, and what can be expected from US-Chinese relations moving forward, the possibility of the intensification of conflict potential between North and South Korea? Yeah, that would be all.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got geopolitical shifts in the Pacific, we've got Germany, and we've got disinformation. Do you want to start picking up some of these, Rachel?
Sure. I mean, disinformation is huge, and it's not even primarily anymore. I mean, some of it is foreign originated, but you have it picked up by the vice presidential candidate and the presidential candidate now. And that's something to consider, is that a good chunk of Trump voters also just live in a different information world. So they have a different set of facts that they're voting on. And this is a huge problem in American democracy right now. There are, concentrated campaigns from outside, but there's also just a really problematically divided information landscape and a very corrupted information landscape in the US. And with no evident solution in the short or medium term. On the Pacific question, I'll take that one. Yes, I mean, one should absolutely expect a sort of harshening in tone. I mean, the Biden administration carried on a lot of the Trump policies. So it won't be a sort of fundamental shift, but the tone will be potentially harsher with potentially more escalation potential, because you have, a president who might be slightly less controlled by the people around him. And he'll certainly be surrounded by China hawks. So that's one element. And the other important element for the Europeans is the politics will be less coordinated and discussed, and will be more placing demands on the Europeans. So I would expect a lot of pressure on and linking of these issues from the Trump administration with NATO partners to forcefully expect the Europeans to fall much more in line on the Washington line on China. And as we saw with the recent EV vote, this is going to be, particularly for Germany, a challenge.
Thanks. Daniel.
Yeah, I would maybe alter that a little bit, or suggest another view. So we don't know who's going to be whispering in Trump's ear on China, and if it's someone like Elbridge Colby, it will certainly be a very hard line. Trump, in my view, does not instinctively want to have a big conflict with China. What he wants from China is a big shiny thing to say, here, see what I brought home, much as was the case regarding tariffs and then the purchase of American goods in the last administration. He said harsher things about Taiwan in the last few weeks than he did about China. So a lot will depend on who is at his elbow. It's a joke that his policy is always the last person he talked to. And there are lots of different voices in the Republican Party on this issue. What I do think is true is that China may well wind up being one of the issues that most divides the United States and Europe. As whatever it is Trump decides to do, he will try to push Europeans to fall in line.
I think Thomas should talk about the German elections. I don't want to talk about that. I mean, look, only to say the most recent 3 elections that we saw in Germany were also a kind of peace, I'm doing this in quotes, were showing strong support for a quick end to the war in Ukraine too. So I think this is going to be a democratic challenge in Germany, whether the elections are sooner or later with a Trump administration. Yeah.
Thanks. Unless there are any other questions, I'll give Tom another chance for a quick one because we're running out of time. The microphone is just to your left.
I should have also said I'm with the Wilson Center, but external in Washington. Not to be sort of histrionic about this, but I think Trump smells weakness. If you look at the financial structure of Germany, Deutsche Bank, I mean, all the big banks have been replaced by BlackRock and similar. So the ownership, and you see that German companies are investing overseas. They're moving production overseas, largely to the States. And energy, I'm sorry, the CDU has no idea what to do. You can see what's happened the last few days, separate from the hegemony of these ideas that it has. And the research and development was killed under Merkel and Schäuble as far as reindustrialization. So you have this deindustrialization. Trump smells this. And I think he's going to push for a dependent Germany in any way possible. I'd like to know if people think about this.
In light of your analysis of Trump and in light of the situation of the German government at the moment, can I invite all of the panelists in a way of closing remarks to come up with something that you would tell the German government in this situation right now, an advice you would give, a person you would advise them to speak to, an analysis you would advise them to run? What are your recommendations for immediate reactions to the German government? Thomas, can we start with you?
Yeah. Election isn't even over, and now we all have to fall into policy already. That's a tough one. Now, but seriously, the first thing I think I've already mentioned is you have to get a handle on Ukraine policy under the new conditions, and there has to be a decision in what direction the Europeans together want to go on Ukraine. Is this the moment to bury some principles on European debt and finance weapons purchases for Ukraine through Europe, or is this the moment to fall in line with with Trump on the question of ending the war? So that's the first major decision. The second bigger decision to be made is the more in general, how much in line with Trump does German policy want to fall? Because my prediction would be that the idea that Europeans will now have to stick together, that is touted so often, is a mirage. They will fall into at least two, probably three different categories, and will split. First, there is those who around Viktor Orban who will welcome this change and see it as the beginning of a domino effect within Europe, and see the new transatlantic relations between the Orbans of this world and the Orbans of Europe and Trump. So those who like what's coming at them. The others, probably led by Poland, who are close to neo-imperial Russia, who will fall in line with Trump, not because they like it, but because they have to. And then there will be the French, who, armed with nuclear deterrence, will tout the sovereignty, the European sovereignty horn. And the Germans, it would be my guess, would probably fall more into the Polish line. There will be an accommodation on multiple fronts and an attempt to sell what Germany is doing to Donald Trump as a consequence of weakness in defense in the face of a neo-imperial Russia. And there will be an element of hedging, looking at the fact that this is a second-term presidency that will have post-congressional elections in 2 years, will largely be a lame duck presidency. So that would be my prediction of what would be happen. It's not exactly is not a recommendation, but more of an analysis of what we might be seeing.
Thank you for this amount of clarity after a long election night, countless interviews. Daniel, do you have anything to add as a way of closing remarks?
Well, I do fully agree with Thomas on the need for the Europeans to do some hard thinking together on the question of Ukraine. He's undoubtedly a better realist than I am. I am persuaded by those who would say this is a moment for core Europeans, which is to say not Viktor Orban, to get together and figure out how they maximize their leverage and use this opportunity to stop faffing about and build a better Europe, or they'll be in this situation forever. Maybe This audience has heard that one time too many, but I do think Europe's problems can only be solved by more Europe, and there ought to be some intense discussion. And I could hardly be more disappointed than I am by what has happened, for example, between France and Germany over the last 3 or 4 years.
Rachel, it's been a long night of analyses, worries, and interviews as well. What are your thoughts on this morning?
I mean, too many thoughts, but I'll end on, picking up on what Daniel said. My advice would be, whether my analysis is that this will happen, because as Daniel pointed out, this has been the advice for a long time. We had the answer to the German question, and that answer was Europe. That is still the answer. And maybe the opportunity that Germany knows it alone does not have good standing with the Trump administration, may be a good motivation to get Berlin working in new ways and better with Paris. I'd like to see Paris, Warsaw, and Berlin working together and coming to the Trump administration with a good, strong plan. And this would be my advice.
At DGAP, we will continue to look for answers in our morning briefing series, which will pick up again next Thursday, not tomorrow, but next Thursday, and in various other events, including an online debate by our International Politik quarterly magazine, IPQ, this afternoon, and many others. So please check out our events page for updates, and please join me in thanking our excellent panel for their insights, Daniel Benjamin, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, and Rachel Tausendfreund, as well as all of the team here at DGAP. Have a wonderful morning despite these results.